This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The History of England, from the Accession of James II, by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Book 1, Chapter 3, Part 3. The only army which the law recognized was the militia. That force had been remodeled by 2 Acts of Parliament, passed shortly after the Restoration. Every man who possessed £500 a year derived from land, or £6,000 of personal estate, was bound to provide, equip, and pay, at his own charge, 1 horseman. Every man who had £50 a year derived from land, or £600 of personal estate, was charged in like manner with 1 pikeman or musketeer. Smaller proprietors were joined together in a kind of society, for which our language does not afford a special name, but which an Athenian would have called a syntelia, and each society was required to furnish, according to its own means, a horse soldier or a foot soldier. The whole number of cavalry and infantry thus maintained was popularly estimated at 130,000 men. The king was, by the ancient constitution of the realm, and by the recent and solemn acknowledgment of both houses of Parliament, the sole captain-general of this large force. The Lords Lieutenant and their deputies held the command under him, and appointed meetings for drilling and inspection. The time occupied by such meetings, however, was not to exceed 14 days in 1 year. The justices of the peace were authorized to inflict severe penalties for breaches of discipline. Of the ordinary cost no part was paid by the crown, but when the train bands were called out against an enemy, their subsistence became a charge on the general revenue of the state, and they were subject to the utmost rigor of martial law. There were those who looked on the militia with no friendly eye. Men who had traveled much on the continent, who had marveled at the stern precision with which every sentinel moved and spoke in the citadels built by Vauban, who had seen the mighty armies which poured along all the roads of Germany to chase the Ottoman from the gates of Vienna, and who had been dazzled by the well-ordered pomp of the household troops of Lewis, sneered much at the way in which the peasants of Devonshire and Yorkshire marched and wheeled, shouldered muskets, and ported pikes. The enemies of the liberties and religion of England looked with aversion on a force which could not, without extreme risk, be employed against those liberties and that religion, and missed no opportunity of throwing ridicule on the rustic soldiery. Enlightened patriots, when they contrasted these rude levies with the battalions which, in times of war, a few hours might bring to the coast of Kent or Sussex, were forced to acknowledge that, dangerous as it might be to keep up a permanent military establishment, it might be more dangerous still to stake the honor and independence of the country on the result of a contest between ploughmen officered by justices of the peace and veteran warriors led by marshals of France. In Parliament, however, it was necessary to express such opinions with some reserve, for the militia was an institution eminently popular. Every reflection thrown on it excited the indignation of both the great parties in the state, and especially of that party which was distinguished by peculiar zeal for monarchy and for the Anglican Church. The array of the counties was commanded almost exclusively by Tory noblemen and gentlemen. They were proud of their military rank, and considered an insult offered to the service to which they belonged as offered to themselves. They were also perfectly aware that whatever was said against a militia was said in favor of a standing army, and the name of the standing army was hateful to them. One such army had held dominion in England, and under that dominion the king had been murdered, the nobility degraded, the landed gentry plundered, the church persecuted. There was scarcely a rural grandee who could not tell a story of wrongs and insults suffered by himself or by his father at the hands of the parliamentary soldiers. One old cavalier had seen his manor house blown up. The hereditary elms of another had been hewn down. A third could never go into his parish church without being reminded by the defaced scutcheons and headless statues of his ancestry that Oliver's redcoats had once stabled their horses there. The consequence was that those very royalists, who were most ready to fight for the king themselves, were the last persons whom he could venture to ask for the means of hiring regular troops. Charles, however, had a few months after his restoration begun to form a small standing army. He felt that, without some better protection than that of the train bands and beefeaters, His palace and person would hardly be secure, in the vicinity of a great city swarming with warlike Fifth Monarchy men who had just been disbanded. He therefore, careless and profuse as he was, contrived to spare from his pleasures a sum sufficient to keep up a body of guards. With the increase of trade and of public wealth his revenues increased, and he was thus enabled, in spite of the occasional murmurs of the Commons, to make gradual additions to his regular forces. One considerable addition was made a few months before the close of his reign. The costly, useless, and pestilential settlement of Tangier was abandoned to the barbarians who dwelt around it, and the garrison, consisting of 1 regiment of horse and 2 regiments of foot, was brought to England. The little army formed by Charles II was the germ of that great and renowned army which has, in the present century, marched triumphant into Madrid and Paris, into Canton and Kandahar. The Life Guards, who now form 2 regiments, were then distributed into 3 troops, each of which consisted of 200 carabiners, exclusive of officers. This corps, to which the safety of the king and royal family was confided, had a very peculiar character. Even the privates were designated as gentlemen of the guard. Many of them were of good families, and had held commissions in the Civil War. Their pay was far higher than that of the most favored regiment of our time, and would in that age have been thought a respectable provision for the younger son of a country squire. Their fine horses, their rich housings, their cuirasses, and their buff coats adorned with ribbons, velvet, and gold lace, made a splendid appearance in St. James's Park. A small body of grenadier dragoons, who came from a lower class and received lower pay, was attached to each troop. Another body of household cavalry, distinguished by blue coats and cloaks, and still called the Blues, was generally quartered in the neighborhood of the capital. Near the capital lay also the corps which is now designated as the 1st Regiment of Dragoons, but which was then the only regiment of dragoons on the English establishment. It had recently been formed out of the cavalry which had returned from Tangier. A single troop of dragoons, which did not form part of any regiment, was stationed near Berwick, for the purpose of keeping the peace among the moss troopers of the border. For this species of service the dragoon was then thought to be peculiarly qualified. He has since become a mere horse soldier. But in the 17th century he was accurately described by Montecuculi as a foot soldier who used a horse only in order to arrive with more speed at the place where military service was to be performed. The household infantry consisted of 2 regiments, which were then, as now, called the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards and the Coldstream Guards. They generally did duty near Whitehall and St. James's Palace. As there were then no barracks, and as, by the petition of right, it had been declared unlawful to quarter soldiers on private families, the redcoats filled all the alehouses of Westminster and the Strand. There were 5 other regiments of foot. One of these, called the Admiral's Regiment, was especially destined to service on board of the fleet. The remaining 4 still rank as the first 4 regiments of the line. 2 of these represented 2 brigades which had long sustained on the Continent the fame of British valor. The 1st, or Royal Regiment, had, under the great Gustavus, borne a conspicuous part in the deliverance of Germany. The 3rd Regiment, distinguished by flesh-colored facings, from which it had derived the well-known name of the Buffs, had, under Maurice of Nassau, fought not less bravely for the deliverance of the Netherlands. Both these gallant bands had at length, after many vicissitudes, been recalled from foreign service by Charles II, and had been placed on the English establishment. The regiments which now rank as the 2nd and 4th of the line had, in 1685, just returned from Tangier, bringing with them cruel and licentious habits contracted in a long course of warfare with the Moors. A few companies of infantry which had not been regimented lay in garrison at Tilbury Fort, at Portsmouth, at Plymouth, and at some other important stations on or near the coast. End of Part 3.